Welcome to today's explainer. Imagine trying to map out the exact architecture of the next major global conflict. What most of us would just call World War III, but doing it while completely throwing out the standard Western playbook. Well, today we're exploring a deeply fascinating, entirely non-Western framework for predicting the future of global conflict. Our source material maps out the upcoming world order by actually blending hard, measurable geopolitical analysis with ancient religious texts. It's a hugely ambitious, totally different lens for looking at international relations, and we're going to break down exactly how this author builds his case to predict a radically altered globe. Okay, let's dive into this. When we look at all the global tensions right now, how do we actually predict what happens next? Standard Western political science usually just relies on, economic indicators, diplomatic cables, maybe military capabilities. But today's analysis takes a remarkably different approach. It steps way outside that traditional boundary and asks a wild question. What if ancient texts actually hold the structural blueprint for modern warfare? The source material uses this beautiful calligraphy to set the tone for what is truly a synthesis of the sacred and the strategic. The author here builds his predictions not just by, say, looking at GDP or counting up military arsenals, but by cross-referencing hard, modern geopolitical data with Islamic eschatology. And if you're not familiar, that's essentially the theological study of the end of times. It's a methodology that literally intertwines the physical world with the metaphysical. Now, let's be super clear about exactly what we're doing in this explainer. We are mapping out the author's mind and his specific theories. We're exploring this methodology as a really fascinating analytical framework, seeing how earthly variables, whether that's shifting GDPs, plummeting birth rates, or the massive size of modern military arsenals, are measured against the strict timeline of textual prophecies. We aren't here to endorse these predictions as absolute truth. No, we just want to impartially understand this highly unique way of visualizing the future global map and see what it might tell us about the world's most dangerous flashpoints. So here's our roadmap for today. 1. The Indo-Pakistani balance. 2. Turkey and Iran. 3. The Turkish-European balance. 4. The superpower shift. And 5. Emerging Islamic centers.
Starting with number 1, the Indo-Pakistani balance, also known as the Eastern Front.
I want you to consider the current very real tensions in South Asia, but look at them through this unique prophetic lens. And this brilliantly illustrates the author's core method. He contrasts the modern geopolitical reality, which is, let's face it, a terrifying escalating nuclear race and a bitter Cold War between India and Pakistan, with textual prophecy. The author points to specific hadiths, the recorded sayings and traditions of the Prophet Muhammad, that explicitly speak of a massive conquest of India right before major eschatological milestones like the descent of Jesus. So the author argues this regional nuclear standoff isn't just some localized border dispute, it's a meticulously foretold precursor. In this framework, the Indo-Pakistani conflict is the Great Spark, a massive clash that forces the major global powers to finally overextend their military and economic resources, which ultimately ignites systemic worldwide shifts. Moving to number 2, Turkey and Iran, diverging paths. Moving geographically westward into the Middle East, we arrive at our second balance of power. The source presents this stark, almost unbelievable contrast between these two regional heavyweights, and how differently they've played their hands for the future. The author outlines what he calls Iran's political enjoyment in exhausting sectarian proxy wars, specifically pointing to endless grinding arenas like Syria, Iraq, and Yemen. According to the text, this deep military involvement has just severely drained Iran's treasury and heavily damaged its reputation across the broader Islamic world, alienating millions. Conversely, Turkey is highlighted for its strategic restraint. By staying out of the deepest military mud, avoiding those direct quagmires, Turkey has preserved its economy, fostered massive infrastructure growth, and gained immense regional favor. They've built this incredible soft power empire through global media and television exports, really positioning themselves as a modern, stable beacon, while their rival just exhausts itself. Next up is number 3, the Turkish-European balance, a reversal of fortunes. When looking at this shifting dynamic, the source sees a stark contrast that flips traditional Western expectations completely upside down. For Europe, the author sees a long-term economic trajectory of decline and stagnation, coupled with a political state that is actively retreating from its own championed democratic values, especially when you look at its often contradictory diplomatic dealings. Meanwhile, Turkey is showing significant growth, continuously rising regional influence, and a self-reliant economy.
The source makes a really compelling argument here. Heavy-handed European interference in Turkish domestic politics is actually backfiring terribly. It's accelerating Europe's own moral and economic decline by exposing its hypocrisies, while paradoxically unifying the Turkish population and boosting its ascent. Think about the balance of power we usually just take for granted. We tend to assume European stability and dominance is a permanent fixture, but the source argues the momentum has already decisively shifted.
That brings us to number 4, the superpower shift, America, Israel, and China. Now we're zooming out to the macro-level global climax. So the crucial point is how this transition of absolute global supremacy actually unfolds according to the author. In the present, the U.S. economic engine is viewed as stalling out, heavily burdened by decades of military overextension, domestic division, and just immense debt. In the near future, the text makes a very specific, striking prediction. Powerful global financial lobbies, the actual entities that move and protect global wealth, are going to recognize this terminal decline. They will actively begin shifting their assets, eventually abandoning the collapsing U.S. dollar. And the future result? China emerges as the unquestioned unipolar economic giant, absorbing all that migrating global financial power. I mean, just pause and ask yourself, what happens to the entire global order when the U.S. dollar is no longer the anchor of global wealth? The author argues the ripple effects are going to reshape literally every border on Earth.
But what about the Middle East in this new ununipolar world under Chinese economic dominance? The author uses this fantastic metaphor from local folklore, comparing Israel to Goha's nail. The story goes that a man named Goha sold his house, but he insisted on keeping ownership of a single nail on the living room wall. This gave him a perpetual, legal excuse to intrude on the new owners whenever he wanted, just to check on his nail. The author argues Israel serves as this exact type of geopolitical wedge, a permanent, structural pretext for outside major powers to intervene in the Middle East. The really fascinating question posed by the text is this: how will a purely economically driven, ununipolar China approach this existing male compared to the ideological and political way America historically has?
Finally, we have number 5, emerging Islamic power centers, the new map.
As we enter the final phase of this framework, we really have to ask what actually happens on the ground when the geopolitical map is wiped clean. The collapse of American and European hegemony, alongside the inevitable weakening of their regional proxies, doesn't just leave some empty space. It creates a massive, unprecedented political and military vacuum across the entire Islamic world. The old powers recede, and the center completely drops out.
Let's move to and see how this builds perfectly into the author's synthesis of prophecy and reality. The author looks at specific hadith references that mention powerful, victorious armies emerging from Sham, Yemen, and Iraq at the end of times. And he brilliantly aligns these ancient texts with the grim modern reality of these exact regions. I mean, why these 3? Well, Sham, or modern Syria, has been hardened by relentless, multi-dimensional, continuous conflict. Its surviving factions are incredibly resilient. Yemen has been forged through grueling regional wars and blockades, relying on these deeply entrenched, self-sustaining tribal structures that simply outlast modern military campaigns. And Iraq has developed incredibly high political and urban military expertise through decades of foreign occupation and internal struggle. So the result of this vacuum? Instead of a single centralized empire rising up, the region is filled by decentralized, battle-hardened, and highly capable independent power centers that no longer need a superpower patron to survive.
And this brings our theoretical journey through the source material to a close. We've seen how the author meticulously stitches together ancient prophetic texts with the very real, hard data of shifting global power. It's a comprehensive vision of World War III, starting with the spark of a nuclear East, amplified by the strategic divide between an exhausted Iran and a rising Turkey, accelerated by European decline, cemented by global financial lobbies fleeing the U.S. for a rising China, and culminating in a decentralized, battle-hardened Middle East. It is a bold, highly unorthodox framework that forces us to look at our world through an entirely different paradigm. Which leaves us with this final thought. If this framework holds even a fraction of the truth, and the current Western-dominated system is as fragile and temporary as the author suggests, are we actually ready to navigate this radically new global map? It certainly makes you ponder the unseen currents driving international relations, and perhaps encourages us to look for answers in texts and histories we might usually ignore. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer. Keep questioning, keep learning, and I'll see you in the next one.